Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again, where today we are going to be looking at a film which signals the end of a very particular era of the Bond franchise. It was the last film in the series to be produced by both Harry Saltzman and Cubby Broccoli, the last of 4 films to be directed by Guy Hamilton, and the last of 3 to have Tom Mankiewicz on script duty in some capacity, and along with Diamonds Are Forever and Live and Let Die, it forms a kind of trilogy prompted by the crisis of faith the series had following the, at the time, lukewarm reception to Majesty's Secret Service and whether Bond as a franchise could survive without Sean Connery. Obviously, Live and Let Die proved that that was a possibility. It was a great success when it was released in the summer of 1973, and I guess that success galvanized everyone to churn out another one as quickly as possible, as The Man with the Golden Gun was released in December 1974, and yet it was not terribly well received and ranks towards the bottom of the list when you take into account critical reviews and box office numbers for the series. But it does nonetheless have a special place in the hearts of many a Bond fan for a variety of reasons, and in this video we will be looking at the film's many failures, but also its successes. So with all that in mind, let's dive right in, shall we, and take a look at The Man with the Golden Gun. The film begins, as is custom, with the gun barrel, followed by the pre-title sequence, and as with Live and Let Die, the sequence does not feature James Bond himself, but rather acts as an introduction to the main villain of the film, the triple-nippled Francisco Scaramanga, played by Christopher Lee. The whole 3-nipple thing doesn't really have much of an impact on the story at large, but it is a really memorable detail, and I can't help but feel bad for Scaramanga, who, a crack shot with a golden gun, a funhouse, and an exotic island as his home, and what's the first thing that springs to mind whenever I think of the villain? Triple nipples! Sorry, Francisco. Scaramanga's henchperson Knick-Knack, played by Hervé Villachet, has arranged for a gangster, played by Mark Lawrence, to engage Scaramanga in a gun battle. You might recognise this gangster from a couple of films ago in Diamonds Are Forever, and if you're like me, you'll like to think that he's playing the same character here. I'm not sure if it was really intended to be the same guy as was in Las Vegas, but I just love the idea that such a minor character would return and sort of skirt the edges of a couple of different Bond adventures. Anyway, the whole point of this is that Knick-Knack frequently enlists freelance hoods to combat Scaramanga for 2 reasons. The first being to keep Scaramanga's game up, but also that if Scaramanga dies, Knick-Knack inherits his estate. I think it's quite a nice, twisted little detail. I don't think it does anything to really further the plot or advance the story in any way, but it's just a really weird, interesting little dynamic between Knick-Knack and Scaramanga that I think enhances their relationship. As Scaramanga and the Hood start battling, we are quickly introduced to Scaramanga's funhouse, which is just a part of the super cool villain's lair setup that he has here. Of all the Bond villain lairs, I think this is the one that I would most want to live in. It's in this fabulous location, it has all the mod cons, the living areas are decadent, and then you have this kick-ass funfair built into the same space. I mean, quite what Scaramanga uses this place for when he's not having shootouts with hired gangsters is another thing entirely. Maybe this is just his Westworld prototype? I mean, he does have some pretty cool animatronics in there, and hey, they're so lifelike, this one even flinches. I mean, seriously, couldn't they have cut around this or gotten an actor who wasn't terrified by the sound of his own gun going off? The main areas we see of the funhouse are the Wild West and, I guess, 1920s Chicago and, abstract shape land? Disney World really is missing a trick by not having one of those, but I like that in other shots we get hints at there being so much more in there. Like in this shot of Lee, he stood next to some statues that look kind of Viking, Nordic inspired, and this is really the only hint that we get of such a zone, but I think it's really cool. And now again, I don't know if this is intentional or if the props guys were just literally going to whatever film was shooting next door and throwing whatever props they could find into this sequence, but all the same, it's pretty cool. I think this whole pre-title sequence is really cool, particularly when you compare it to Live and Let Die, which I don't think I ever really considered, but I think it is one of the weaker pre-title sequences of the entire series, primarily because it doesn't do the 3 things that I think a Bond title sequence needs to do one or all of. Reintroduce us to our hero 007 doing a bunch of cool things, give us a big action spectacle, and or introduce us to the film's villain. Obviously Golden Gun does the latter, and it does it really well as introduce the guy's signature weapon, the Golden Gun itself, and also his apparent fascination with James Bond, given that in his funhouse he has a lifelike statue of the agent, and I would love to know how the heck he got this thing made, and precisely how many eyebrows were raised by the person who was hired to sculpt this. So Scaramanga kills the Hood and proceeds to vandalize his own property. So here, Scaramanga fires 5 times. 4 of the shots we see shoot off the statue's fingers, but the 5th shot we don't see. So, what waist down appendage do we think Scaramanga went for, ladies and gentlemen? Can I phone a friend, please, Jeremy? Anyway, if that didn't get you thinking about penises, cue Lulu and the most innuendo-laden Bond song ever. Actually, innuendo is probably giving it a little bit too much credit. As much as I love this song, and I really do, the lyrics are just nuts. And in places you'd be forgiven for thinking that it was some kind of parody Bond song, but you know what, I like that it's energetic and fun, and it does match the raciness of the images in the title sequence itself very well. I mean, I feel like we get closer to actual full-on nudity here than what we're used to, particularly in this silhouette, which leaves absolutely nothing to the imagination. Anyway, after all that, it's time for Roger Moore's first scene in M's office, and it quickly becomes apparent that literally no one on Bond's side likes him in this film. M in particular is in such a crusty mood, and we'll talk more about that later, but even these other guys are like avoiding eye contact and looking pissed off with him.
Good morning, sir. Carl Thorpe, Chief of Staff.
All he did was say hi, you miserable bastards. By the way, one of these guys is Bill Tanner, who is a recurring character in the Ian Fleming books and becomes a recurring character in the film series much later on, and it feels like the inclusion of that character should be a bit of a bigger deal, but nothing is made of it, and if I'm honest, I'm far more interested in the guy next to him, who was mistaken for a hotel inspector in a really great episode of Fawlty Towers. But he literally says nothing in this scene, and I have no idea why these two were necessary for the scene at all, but it does begin something of a tradition of the briefing scene including a assortment of government officials rather than just being Bond and M together. There's something to be said about the intimacy of these scenes in the 60s, where most of them are just Bond and M together, and it helps it portray this idea that everything that is going on is happening under the radar. Like, you could literally count on one hand how many people know that this conversation is even taking place between these two people. And yet from this point onwards we have a lot of government ministers and other MI6 staff involved in the briefings, and while I understand that having more people there helps it feel more stakesy, like there's more people that need to be involved in whatever this conversation is, it does make things feel less espionage-y, I suppose. Anyway, they discuss Scaramanga and we see a golden bullet with 007 etched into it that has been sent to MI6 and is proving very annoying for M, who has to remove Bond from his current assignment looking for some energy expert for fear of Bond being killed by Scaramanga, with the bullet implying that the villain has Bond in his sights. M is especially crusty here, and he's like, yeah, if you want to object to what I'm telling you and resign, then fine, do it, see if I care. But at the end of the scene there is a nice moment where Bond hints that he's going to go after Scaramanga, and M gets a little twinkle in his eye, and man, I just love how Bernard Lee could switch it on and off. Like, he just lets his crusty guard down for a moment before putting it right back on again. It's great. After this, Bond gets some information from Moneypenny about his colleague 002, who was supposedly murdered by Scaramanga in a Beirut cabaret club. This is one of the weaker Bond Moneypenny scenes of the series, and it'll be a while before we get some good flirting between Moore and Maxwell. Here, Bond is just straight to the point. There's no coaxing this information out of Moneypenny with charm. He's just like, right, you know this stuff, just tell me. And the closest thing we get to actual flirting is him saying,
Moneypenny, you are better than a computer.
Now, I can't speak from experience, having never used that particular line in person, but I can guarantee that in real life you are not going to get very far from chatting someone up with lines like that. Bond heads to Beirut to try and find the bullet that killed 002, and he finds the dancer that 002 was with when he died, and a fight breaks out with some guys who, I guess, just don't like staff-customer interactions. I'm not a fan of this whole detour to Beirut. I get that Bond needs to do some snooping, and he has no real leads on Scaramanga, so the bullet that killed 002 is the only tangible thing he can get, but there's just so much that puts me off about this sequence. On a superficial level, I think the sets look pretty bad and cheap, and the bland stage lighting does not help matters at all. The dubbing on the belly dancer actress is really distracting. The fight itself is fine, I guess, but these villains have nothing to do with Scaramanga, I don't think, and I guess the bald one just owns the club, or is dating the belly dancer or something, and that's why he gets him and his men to go and beat up Bond. But as a result of all this confusion, the stakes of the situation are really unclear, and it really does just feel like a fight for fight's sake, and I hate this smarmy, faux sexy music that plays when Bond turns on the charms with this belly dancer to try and get the bullet from her.
I'm sure Bill would have loved that.
And then on kind of an underlying level, I guess it bothers me that we're dealing with the death of a 00 agent here, and Bond is just so kind of matter-of-fact about the whole thing, and I would have liked there to be some kind of hint that this investigation is affecting him on some kind of a personal level. Not that, you know, him and Bill Fairbanks need to be best friends who go back to spy training school together decades ago, but just the idea that Bond is investigating the death of a colleague is quite a big, heavy subject matter that this film just does not want to go anywhere near. Bond acquires the bullet and takes it back to be analysed by Q and the Fawlty Towers guy, who, again, I don't know why this guy is here. I mean, nothing against the actor at all, but especially as Bond is just supposed to be investigating off the books here, I think it would have made more sense if this scene was just Bond and Q discussing the bullet in private instead. Anyway, the pair trace the origins of the bullet back to a man called Lazar, who Bond jets off to meet. By the way, this is the 4th Bond film directed by Guy Hamilton, and has anyone else picked up on one of his favourite funny skits is just to have characters looking on neutrally at something else? Like, civilians and animals reacting to things is not an uncommon thing in Bond, but usually they're double-taking or checking whatever they're drinking or smoking, but Hamilton usually just likes to have characters look on silently and neutrally, and he does it here with this family who are eating. I suppose we're supposed to find it funny that they just stop and stare at Bond, but whatever. Bond meets with Lazar and attempts to get some information out of him regarding Scaramanga. This is one of the best scenes in the film, and I'm going to criticise some of Moore's performance later on, but here, when he's threatening Lazar with the rifle, he's just brilliant. His line delivery, how casually he lines up the shot when he's taking aim at Lazar's groin. It's all really great stuff, and one of the times when Moore really pulls off the harder edge part of Bond. The next link on the chain for Bond to follow is to see who picks up the golden bullets on behalf of Scaramanga. This ends up being Andrea Anders, played by Maud Adams, who Bond follows back to her hotel in Hong Kong, bumping into a colleague along the way.
Madam, would you be good enough to move this inverted bedpan?
I'm sorry I'm late, James, but your signal from Macau only just reached the office.
Yes, fellow agent Mary Goodnight, played by Britt Eklund, who is so horny for Bond right off the bat. I mean, it's saying something when a woman is coming onto Bond, and his reaction is to roll his eyes and crack on with the mission rather than stop for a quick one. Now, on the surface, I really like this. The idea that Bond is so driven that he has no time to stop and smell all the roses. And yet, how it's presented and how Moore plays it, it just comes off as he's annoyed at Goodnight, and I'm not quite sure why, because she's clearly done her research, she showed up on time, she's phenomenally attractive, and he certainly won't be objecting to her later on in the film, but for some reason here he's really pissed off with her, and it's a mystery to me as to why. So Bond makes his way into Andrea's room and finds her in the shower. By the way, I really love the John Barry score for this scene. It's really cool and mysterious, and I'm going to say some bad things about his work on this film later on, so I'm giving him a compliment while I can. But in the scene, Andrea pulls a gun on Bond, and he is quickly able to disarm her. So, okay, general thoughts about this scene. It's ostensibly here to introduce us to Andrea, and while it's not until later that we learn that she, in fact, sent the golden bullet to MI6 in the first place, we learn that she is Scaramanga's mole, and from how Maud Adams plays it, the lines she has, she doesn't come across as a character who is very comfortable with her lot in life, and Bond proceeds to rough her up in probably the series' most cruel attitude towards a female character who really doesn't deserve any of this. I think my main problem with Andrea is that she's such a sympathetic character, and the way Maud Adams plays her is like frightened and naive, and we find more out about the character later on, but at this point we just know that she is Scaramanga's mistress, and maybe with a different actress in the part we might have gotten a more femme fatale kind of character, and if it was played that way, with a bit more spunk and a bit more confrontational, then maybe this confrontation with Bond wouldn't feel quite so uncomfortable, but as it stands... I think it's more a fault of the writing and direction than anything else, but what they make Moore do here is so awkward, and he's trying to play it really tough and cold, but he looks so uneasy doing it, and he just comes across really horrible, particularly when he's threatening Andrea that Scaramanga might actually shoot her. I think on a whole his performance here represents a step back from Live and Let Die. I think they were taking his Bond down the wrong path, quite frankly, in this film, and we're lucky that it's immediately corrected in the next film, but here I think this is Roger Moore's least good performance as James Bond by far. Anyway, all of that is immediately undercut by a smash cut to the next scene of the film, which tells us where we're at with sexuality in this film.
Bottoms up.
I think it just signposts that the classiness, the elegance of the sex of the previous films has just dissipated, and here instead we just have, like, literally ass in your face. Anyway, Bond is hanging out at the club waiting for Scaramanga as per Andrea's information. As Bond approaches the club, Scaramanga from the shadows kills a man who is exiting, and Bond is immediately whisked away, and we get one of those extended sequences where Bond is actually in the hands of friends, but they try to generate some suspense by not having them do the obvious thing and say, "Oh hi, how's it going? We share the same bootmaker, right?" No, instead we go through this charade only to be led to the MI6 Hong Kong hideout, which I actually really like. They've set up shop in a sunken ship, and the sets are really cool, they're all at a tilted angle, it's all great stuff, but we get a lot of plot here in this scene. It turns out that the man who was killed outside the club was the missing solar energy expert that Bond was trying to find at the very start of the film. The other chap he was with is a Lieutenant Hip, who was making a preliminary contact with the expert, and that's why M is out there now. And then M makes probably the most cutting comment to Bond ever.
I almost wish that Scaramanga had a contract on you.
Like, wow, that's a pretty big deal, a big thing that we're just going to gloss over. Like, M saying that he wished that Bond had died on a mission is big dramatic stuff, or it should be big dramatic stuff. It certainly is in theory, but this film is not going to develop that any further. It's just going to move on with the plot. There's a moment's silence on Bond's reaction that I don't know what it's trying to convey, really. Is it supposed to be a comedic reaction? It's an odd moment, and it's not developed any further, but it does put M in a really foul mood for the rest of the film. So the short of it is that the expert had developed something called a Solex agitator, an energy source that would solve the world's energy crisis. He had it on him when Hip met him at the bar and presumably nicked it from him when he died. The only lead they have to go on is that the expert was doing some business with a multi-millionaire named High Fat, who Bond hypothesizes could afford to have the expert killed if he'd known that the expert was in touch with the authorities. Meanwhile, Scaramanga heads back to his boat, and he has a dog, which we never see again, but I just wanted to point out that he literally has a dog living on his boat, and we never discover the fate of this animal. I like to think he went on to live a nice life in Sardinia by the beach, or maybe even set up shop in Venice. But anyway, one of the stranger moments in the film happens here when Scaramanga rubs his golden gun over Andrea's face, and I mean, wow, if you weren't clear that the entire film is using this gun as some kind of metaphor, well, here we go. It's like they thought, just in case you weren't paying attention to the song lyrics earlier on, let's make it extra clear here. Bond and Hip head to Bangkok so that Bond can pose as Scaramanga and meet with High Fat, assuming that the pair have never met, and coming across this smutty lady along the way.
How's the water?
Why don't you come in and find out?
Sounds very tempting, Miss,
To me.
Really?
Like, was the director or writers or producers or someone involved in this film just so horny during the development that they just wanted any excuse they could to find a naked lady to put on set? Bond seemingly dupes High Fat into thinking that he is actually Scaramanga, and his performance basically entails sticking on a fake third nipple and slightly deepening his voice.
The man's a menace, he knows something.
Pleasure to meet you, Mr. High Fat. I'm Francisco Scaramanga.
High Fat invites Bond as Scaramanga to dinner tonight, and Bond leaves, but there's a twist. High Fat is already familiar with the real Scaramanga, and it becomes clear that it is all a trap. Later on, Bond gets a lift back to High Fat's place for said dinner by Hip, who is taking his niece's somewhere. It's never really said, given that they're dressed as schoolgirls. I'm guessing it's either a school disco or a fetish night, depending on their ages. Anyway, Bond makes his way through High Fat's garden, which is really cool, and I don't think we spend nearly enough time in this location. He has all these cool sculptures, and it's a great space, which is why it's a shame that we spend all of 2 minutes here watching Bond dig his nails into the ass of a sumo wrestler before being knocked out by Knick-Knack, who, for all intents and purposes, has defeated Bond. Like, High Fat intervenes because he doesn't want bloodshed in his own home, but here Knick-Knack is ready to actually kill Bond. He's ready to put a spear through his neck, but the music really devalues any suspense the moment might have had.
Stop it!
The music just kind of fades out as Knick-Knack is taking aim, which is the exact opposite that should be happening. The music should be ramping up then. But whatever, anyway, because this is a Bond film in the 70s and we're in the East, we're jumping onto a cinematic trend here and we're going to have Bond sent to a fighting dojo to engage in some martial arts combat. I really like the build-up to Bond fighting. I like that we see a couple of guys fight to the death. I like the moves we see Bond's eventual opponent perform, and even though Bond resorts to an underhanded trick to defeat his first opponent, the fight with the dojo's A+ student, Chula, is very good, and I like that the film doesn't even pretend to suggest that this version of Bond could ever be a match for these fights. He gets a few good punches in, don't get me wrong, but he scarpers before the fight is really over, and if I had to put money on one of these guys to win, I'd be putting my gold bullion on Chula. I love how at some point during the fight, Bond clearly makes the decision, like, you know what, I'm up against it here, I think I'm just gonna dive out of the nearest window, it really is the best thing for me to be doing right now. Luckily for Bond, Hip and his nieces turn up, and even more lucky for Bond, Hip's brother runs a karate school, so he can just sit back and relax while the girls do all the hard work. Question, though, it's now clearly the morning after the night before, so what have Hip's nieces been doing all night? Hip certainly seems in a good mood, though, so I'm guessing if what they did involved any kind of stimulant, he probably stuck around for it. In one of the most egregious plot holes of the entire series, Hip, his nieces, and Bond head over to Hip's car. Hip gets in the driver's seat, his niece is in the back, Bond is running around to the passenger seat, but before he gets there, Hip sets off, and his nieces are saying something to him and are clearly somewhat concerned that he's leaving Bond behind, but he keeps on driving anyway? I don't speak Thai, so I have no idea what these girls are saying. I can only assume it's something along the lines of, hey, what the heck are you doing, you psychopath? Why can't you just slow down for literally half a second to let the man that you're working with into the car before he gets beaten up? It's so stupid and annoying that Hip just drives off, and I suppose we're just to believe that he thought that Bond had already got into the back of the car with the girls, but it's really not clear. Obviously, he leaves him behind because the filmmakers want to get Bond into the next situation, which involves a boat chase, but they give no plausible reason as to why this situation would manifest, and it's very annoying that they clearly thought so little of the audience that no one would care, but it's really just shining a light on the overall messiness of this script. But whatever, on to the boat chase. I mean, that's probably overselling it a bit. There aren't many great stunts, and the action is rather tepid, really. However, it is notable for having Bond interacting with a child, which is something that we don't often see in this series. It's also quite something to see future UNICEF ambassador Roger Moore fling an impoverished adolescent into a disease-ridden canal.
I'll tell you what, Sonny, I'll give you 20,000 baht if you can make this heat go any faster.
20,000 baht!
I'm afraid I have to owe you.
Bloody tourist!
This film really does represent Bond at his most cruel, don't you think? Like, along with beating up women and throwing children from boats, I'm amazed we don't have a scene of Bond strangling Scaramanga's dog to death to explain why it doesn't appear in the rest of the film. To further add to the absolute insanity of what's going on, Sheriff J.W. Pepper of the Louisiana State Police just so happens to be vacationing with his wife in Thailand while Bond is here on his mission. This makes absolutely no sense at all, but at this point the script really does just feel like it doesn't have to make any excuse for the complete irrationality of mostly everything we're seeing unfold in front of us, and now we just have Sheriff Pepper heckling from the sidelines while Bond disables the villains before an elephant attacks the US law enforcer and pushes him into the canal. So, if you saw my previous film review, you will know that I am a big fan of Sheriff Pepper, and even though I have no grounds at all to stand on to justify his appearance in this film, he's completely out of place. He confounds issues that the film already has with plot and logic. All that being said, I love that he's here. He brings a smile to my face every time he's on screen. I am so glad that someone somewhere decided that he was going to be an appropriate element to reappear in the Bond series. I absolutely love this character. And you can direct all of your angry comments to the comment section below. Anyway, we need to pick up with Scaramanga, who heads over to Hi-Fat and is obviously annoyed that Bond escaped. Hi-Fat passes the Solex agitator to Scaramanga, who then proceeds to assemble his golden gun from the objects he takes from his pocket. It makes for a cool gadget and a great scene, but quite why Scaramanga needed a weapon that could be broken down into several components is unclear, in the film at least. It's not like he ever has to hide it during going through customs or anything like that, but whatever, it's hard to get too hung up on such a small thing after all the action we just witnessed. Hi-Fat is killed, and then we head over to Bond and Goodnight, who are dining and sharing terrible wine.
Foo yuck.
At this point, we're over an hour into the film, and Bond hasn't shagged anyone yet, so it's no surprise he turns on the charms with Goodnight here. And when I say charms, I mean excruciatingly thinly veiled, desperate ramblings. The music and dialogue is trying to sell us on genuine romance, but Moore plays this scene pretty badly. He's gritting his teeth and delivering his lines so sincerely and just gurning at her. It's no wonder she takes off, but I do love the line.
Oh, darling, I'm tempted. But killing a few hours as one of your passing fancies isn't quite my scene.
At this point, I'm like, yeah, go Goodnight. This man has been an absolute ass to you this whole film, and he's only being charming to you now because he's got nothing better to do with his spare time. He even actually says at one point, oh yeah, if Hip doesn't get a lead, then there's nothing else for us to really do, is there? Like, that's some kind of great chat-up line. Like, oh, thank you, mister, really. I mean, I'm so pleased when Goodnight decides, you know what, I'm better than this. You toddle off back to your hotel room. I am an agent. I am a colleague. I'm going to go to my own room. I am not a piece of meat for you to... Oh, what the hell, Goodnight? It kind of makes the entire previous scene pointless. Like, do we really need a whole scene of her saying, hey, I really don't want to sleep with you, for her attitude in the very next scene to be, oh, I'm going to sleep with you? Also, what the heck is it with Bond just lifting up the sheets and gesturing to the bed here like it's some kind of charming move?
Shall we initiate sexual congress?
Bond must go a little longer without getting his end off, though, because Andrea pops back into the story again, and we have probably the most uncomfortable scene in the film. So Bond is just raging horny at this point. We're 70 minutes into the film, Goodnight is hidden under the sheets like something out of a farcical comedy, and then Andrea is here, pouring her heart out, like pleading with Bond. She's talking about how she sent the bullet to MI6 because she had heard about Bond, and she wants out of this horrible relationship she's in. Maud Adams is playing this so sincerely, and Bond is acting all smarmy and flippant. At one point, Andrea literally offers herself, like she is going to prostitute herself so that she can potentially get out of this horrific abusive relationship that she's in. And what does Bond do? He gurns and asks about a flipping Solex agitator. I'm really hung up on this point, but it's something that just stands out as a thoroughly unpleasant aspect of the film, and it says a lot about how you pitch Bond and how he interacts with certain female characters through the lens of his sexism and misogyny. Bond is a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. That is his character. That is who he is. And yet, the film itself doesn't have to be sexist and misogynist, and that's the difference. The film treats Andrea appallingly, and I can't help that I feel some sympathy for a character like her who is portrayed the way she is, the experiences she has had to endure, and Maud Adams' very sympathetic and I think very good performance create a character who I want to see do well, and if not do well, I at least want her to mean something to someone. But neither of those things happen, so I just get the feeling that no one on screen and no one behind the scenes really cares about this character other than just a thing for Bond to have sex with and then eventually bring him what he wants. And it just didn't have to feel this way if they'd played the scene differently, if Bond had been brought around to Andrea here, and we got a sense that he actually cared even one iota for her plight, and that she was having sex with him for reasons beyond feeling like she needs to prostitute herself to get him to do what she wants. When she says,
I've dreamed about you setting me free.
I take that as she's been dreaming about being set free. Doesn't matter who does it, but she's having to pretend that she's interested in him because she feels that that's the only way she can get through to him. I think a better way to handle a character like this was exemplified in Skyfall with Severine. Her and Anders share an awful lot of similarities. They're both kept women, both want Bond to defeat the man keeping them, they both sleep with Bond, they're both killed, and all these elements are handled so much better in Skyfall without Bond coming across so icky. Of course, Bond's mind is eyes on how these women, in both cases, can help him with his mission. That's correct from a character perspective. His mind should always be on the mission. It's fully in his character to sleep with both of these women, but the fact that Severine wants that too makes a difference. I never get the sense that Andrea genuinely wants to be with Bond because she's fallen for him or anything. And yeah, I'm reading a lot into this. This is exactly what I do on this channel, and I don't necessarily think that there is any intended subtext to the character in the film, but I think that the reading I have is there, and it bothers me, and I guess I just wish that the character had been written by someone with a greater sense of emotional intelligence than what we actually get. But who needs that when you can shove Britt Ekland in a closet while Bond and Andrea have sex? This is all very Carry On at this point, but the difference is Carry On can be pretty funny. This is not. Anyway, Bond arranges with his cohorts to pick up the Solex agitator from Andrea at a boxing match. He goes and sits next to her, and in quite a haunting sequence of shots we see that she is dead and frozen in place. There's no real sympathy from any of the characters though, as Scaramanga appears next to Bond and Knick-Knack behind. Scaramanga proceeds to introduce himself and tell Bond a bit of his life story, which Bond looks completely disinterested in, and instead occupies himself collecting the Solex agitator from the floor. Scaramanga's speech is quite short, and I just wish that this had been expanded out into some great Bond villain speech like Silver's in Skyfall, particularly when you have a fantastic actor like Christopher Lee at your disposal, and yet the film cuts away from him for most of the time while he's talking, so it comes through more as background noise while we watch Bond fiddle about with nuts and agitators than any kind of serious dialogue that we need to pay attention to. I'm also confused why Scaramanga would say,
Personally, I've got nothing against you, Mr. Bond, so let us hope that our paths never cross again.
and yet this is the guy who went to the effort of having an identical wax statue made of James Bond and takes great pleasure in shooting at it. I think you do have something against him, Mr. Scaramanga. And actually, if Goodnight hadn't been an idiot and gone and gotten trapped in Scaramanga's boot with the Solex agitator, Scaramanga would have presumably just swanned off and Bond would have returned to MI6 with the Solex and it would be job done. But no, she's locked in a boot and kidnapped, which makes no sense at all. How does Scaramanga know that Goodnight is the one with the Solex? Or was his plan just to kidnap the first woman he came across, seeing as he killed Andrea and he needs some kind of kept woman hanging around his island, so he just thinks this one will do? Anyway, now we have a car chase where I can forget all my criticisms about the handling of the supporting characters in this film and can instead just bask in the unfiltered joy of Sheriff J.W. Pepper.
How about demonstration, boy?
Certainly, sir.
Sidestepping completely the issue of why a Louisiana-based sheriff would be interested in purchasing a vehicle while on holiday in Thailand, I am pleased that he's along for this chase because I love the character and I could watch an entire film of him. I can, however, understand why some would find this annoying, and it certainly highlights the fact that the filmmakers don't have the confidence in Bond to hold the audience's attention for an action sequence by himself. They feel like he needs to have some kind of comedy support tagging along, and that's distressing, I suppose, that a James Bond film doesn't have confidence in James Bond to hold an audience's attention for an action sequence.
Pull your cars over, you little brown ponyhead! I'm a peace officer!
Some of the stunts and moves they have the cars perform are really nice and fun, and of course it all builds up to the famous barrel roll stunt that should be a show-stopping, super exciting moment, but it's all ruined by John Barry's slide whistle. I've talked about this moment at length in other videos, but I just can't get over the fact that that one creative decision, that single solitary thing could completely ruin the climax to this incredible sequence and this amazing, amazing stunt. It's just baffling, and I've seen that shot play like on the making of on the DVDs with different music, and it just goes to show how beautiful and impressive that moment could be. But no, we've got to get a gag in anywhere we can, so get out that slide whistle, boys. In another bizarre turn, the sequence ends with Scaramanga attaching a jet engine and wings to his car and taking off to the sky while the police catch up to Bond, and Sheriff Pepper is presumably led away to spend at least the rest of his vacation in a Thai prison. So with Scaramanga, Goodnight, and the Solex gone, Bond heads back to report to M, and I just love the expression on M's face when Bond is wrapping up his story about the latest events, and presumably M's face here reflects how much of the audience feels at this point of the film. M is in an absolute rage here as well. He's snapping at Q and getting really angry, and to be honest, who can blame him?
Of all the fouled up, half-witted operation.
This mission has been something of a complete farce. Bond and Goodnight have both been incorrect and ineffectual at multiple points, and at this point, if it wasn't for the Solex itself, I would have thought M might just call it a day, but no such luck as they pick up the homing beacon from Goodnight's Q dress, which was very briefly mentioned in dialogue earlier on, so I can't imagine most people would know what the heck they're talking about at this point. But nonetheless, Bond heads over to Scaramanga's Island in a small plane, and I just love these shots of the plane flying low over these amazing islands, and the scenery is great, and the music is lovely, and it's come to something when I'm enjoying some of the scenery shots more than I am the actual plot, but whatever, here we are. Bond lands at Scaramanga's Island to meet with a positively delighted Scaramanga, and I really love Christopher Lee here. You just get the sense that he's so giddy. He finally has James Bond himself here on his island, and he's relishing showing off his home to him, which includes a power plant of some kind. This is where Scaramanga's characterization goes off the rails a bit. He works best when he's just an assassin, a blunt instrument, but the best blunt instrument in the world. But because he's a main Bond villain, I guess they feel like they need to elevate him above that by giving him some bigger, larger stakes objective, and apparently it's renewable energy or something. It feels so odd, especially as he calls out himself that he doesn't really know what the hell he's talking about.
Science was never my strong point.
It's weird because he's the villain in charge of this scheme, and yet he seems to be so disinterested in it. I mean, maybe it would have been worthwhile keeping Mr. High-Fat around as kind of like the money villain guy, with Scaramanga as more of the physical threat, but then I suppose that would make Scaramanga look more like a henchman and not the big bad. It's a problem that was inherent with the character in the Fleming work as well. Like, he is an assassin, he is a very simple killer, and as soon as he starts to talk about his more highfalutin villainous schemes, it just doesn't feel right, and it's a shame that they couldn't fix that flaw in the character from the book to screen transition. Anyway, the MacGuffin for this whole energy plot is the Solex agitator, which for some reason is also powering a big laser gun that Scaramanga has, and I find it weird that he refers to himself as being truly the man with the golden gun in relation to that laser. Like, couldn't they at least have painted it gold or something? And by the way, did they miss the visual effects on this shot or something? It's really weird that we don't see a laser travel from the gun to the exploding plane, and I've always felt like we were missing something from this shot. And also, does this rock really look like a mushroom to anyone? I find it odd that Scaramanga refers to it as a mushroom-shaped rock when it just doesn't look like that, and these are the things that I'm getting hung up on, because really there's very little about Scaramanga's big villain plot that feels true or authentic to the character that we've experienced throughout the rest of the film. I buy Scaramanga as a hitman with a grudge against Bond, and he's desperate to prove that he's better, but beyond that, it just doesn't feel in character for him to care so much about selling off a renewable energy source and this big laser thing to the highest bidder, other than, I mean, yeah, money's alright, but when you charge $1 million a shot and you live in a place like he does, and your favourite hobby is killing people, this whole part of the plan just seems so disingenuous. Anyway, dinner time, and it becomes clear that Scaramanga is indeed keeping Goodnight as his new Andrea, and how did this lady pass any kind of test or exam to be any kind of Secret Service agent when this is her idea of subtle conveyance as she tries to tip Bond off about Scaramanga's scheme?
The fried mushroom looks terribly interesting.
Having fun in the sun, Goodnight?
Yes. I could stay here forever.
Oh good, she likes it here. Otherwise though, I love the exchange between Scaramanga and Bond here. I wish there was more of this, the two killers sparring over a civilized dinner. It's a really nice scene, and when Scaramanga talks about his ultimate dream being to kill 007, I believe him. This motivation feels genuine and believable. It doesn't at all match up with what he was saying earlier on at the boxing match about not having anything against 007, but hey, it's a whole written script, and at this point we just have to accept individual scenes on their own merit. I really can't emphasize enough just how much I love Christopher Lee and Roger Moore here in this scene. They play the exchange so well, and it eventually leads into the one-on-one duel, which I think, for a premise for ending the film, is a really great setup for a climax. the duel itself could be a hell of a lot better. Bond spends a lot of time wandering around, and we replay a lot of the funhouse stuff from the pre-credits scene, while Scaramanga just kind of waits in one spot. There is some material from the early promotion of The Man with the Golden Gun that implies there was originally more going on.
Now I know how you do it, Scaramanga. The secret of success, Mr. Bond. Never take chances.
The implication from Bond's line, "Now I know how you do it," being that presumably Scaramanga is relying on tricks, in this case the explosive that Bond is holding, to win. It's a shame they got rid of that, because I like the idea that Scaramanga is actually a bit of a cheater, and it makes sense with his whole funhouse setup. He thinks he's challenging people one-on-one in fair fights, but in actuality he has to lure them into a place where reality is distorted, and he has the upper hand by way of knowing where all the trick switches are and such, in order to actually win. It would also help make Bond's eventual win more satisfying, as it currently plays like Bond was a bit of a dick and not playing fair rather than beating Scaramanga at his own game by switching places with the waxwork statue. It feels a little underhanded of Bond, when from all what we've seen in the film, Scaramanga has done nothing but play fair in this duel. Or maybe it's just the distraught look on his face that gets me when he dies. I mean, I know I shouldn't feel sorry for this guy, and yet I kinda do. By the way, there's some really confusing editing in this sequence. We know that the Bond wax statue is over in this bit of the funhouse, but when Bond is over here in the Hall of Mirrors, Knick-Knack illuminates the figure in front of Bond, and I guess this is supposed to be where Bond gets the idea to switch places with it, but if Bond can see the waxwork from where he is, then Scaramanga's hanging out in that part, so shouldn't Scaramanga be able to see Bond as well? I don't know, the geography of this place is super confusing, and, oh yeah, meanwhile, Goodnight bludgeons the single employee of this power station and causes him to fall into a vat of liquid nitrogen or something, which starts off a chain reaction which will eventually bring down the whole island in flames and rubble. So with that set off, and Bond having killed Scaramanga, mission's over, right? Well, no. Before that, we have a good 10 minutes more of movie left, involving Bond dislodging the Solex agitator, but being thwarted along the way by Goodnight's arse. But I do love the shots of Roger Moore and Britt Eklund escaping the facility and looking genuinely terrified and falling over each other as the explosions go off around them. I don't think either one is acting here, and this looks like genuine terror on both of their faces. Anyway, the island explodes and Bond and Goodnight have 8 hours to go until Hong Kong, which means it's time for kimonos and sex, which is ruined by Knick-Knack popping up for one last go at Bond, presumably because his inheritance went up in smoke, but this is a really poor final confrontation, and in partly down to the music. It's just this plodding underscore, and it undersells Knick-Knack as a threat. Not that the fight itself is choreographed in an especially exciting or interesting way. In fact, it feels like the scene wasn't really choreographed at all, and the actors just turned up on the set and improvised on the day. Which is a shame, because if they'd have given Knick-Knack some gadgets, or played up the angle that he has the edge on Bond due to secret passages he can get into because of his size and whatnot, it could have been really exciting. But no, in the suitcase he goes, while Bond and Goodnight make out and just ignore a call from M.
Good night. She's just coming, sir.
The ending here is really prolonged and awkward and just not funny. It feels like it's just going through the motions at this point, and tired motions at that, which is probably a way of describing the whole film. So that's The Man with the Golden Gun, the second Roger Moore Bond film, and you know what, back in the 70s, it could well have been the final Roger Moore Bond film. As I said at the start, audience reception and box office for this back in the day weren't great, and it's easy to see why. Things this time around feel rushed, cheap, and incoherent. It's like everyone was so amazed that the world really liked Live and Let Die that they all got fevered about the idea that they could keep on doing this without Sean Connery, and so they charged into making this thing when they really needed an extra 6 months to get things right. And this is all clear from the behind-the-scenes information we have today. Writers were on and off the project, producers had different ideas, and this is all while shooting is taking place, and indeed, the script reeks of unfinishedness. It feels like individual scenes were concocted with no real idea of how to connect them, and this is a fine concept to begin developing a movie from. I mean, Alfred Hitchcock would often start movies with ideas, like he would say, I want a plane to chase a man over an open plain, and then I want a scene on top Mount Rushmore, and he would hire a writer to connect these ideas so that it makes logical sense when the characters progress from one sequence to another. The Man with the Golden Gun is so often lacking in coherence and logic that it it does feel like one writer probably fleshed out a couple of scenes and thought, well, I'll come back to explaining why Scaramanga leaves Bond alone and goes and kidnaps Goodnight another day, but then another writer would be brought on and wouldn't know how to fix it, but oh hey, we're shooting that scene today, what have you got? But as with most of the lesser Bond films, there are elements to enjoy here nonetheless, principally in this case the cast. Christopher Lee and Hervé Villechaize form an iconic pair of villains who really deserve to be in one of the better ones of the series. Not that their talents are wasted here, on the contrary, both of them liven up every single scene they are in. It would just be more apt if they were great villains in a great film, rather than great villains in a relatively disjointed and messy one. Britt Ekland's Mary Goodnight is exactly the character that people think of when they think of Bond girls being bimbos. Even though she is technically an agent, she just meanders around looking absolutely gorgeous, but causing problems for Bond. And not to say I necessarily dislike that, I think she's actually super entertaining and funny in the context of this film, and I have the same thing with Sheriff Pepper. I know that objectively his presence in a Bond film is not good, and yet personally, I have a great time whenever he's on screen. Lieutenant Hip is one of Bond's more bland allies, and I've already talked at length about Maud Adams as Andrea Anders, but that character is really not in the same film that everyone else seems to be in. And I guess that just speaks to the tonal problem that the film has. It has some sort of more darker, seedier elements that could perhaps be expanded in a film where it wasn't like juxtaposed against all the goofy silliness and slapstick that we have. I don't think Roger Moore ever gave a bad performance, but I'd say this is his weakest one as Bond, and I know that a lot of things I complained about are the problems with the script and direction, and he's just kind of reacting to those things. They're making him do these things that he just looks awkward and uncomfortable doing, and the actor himself has said as much in interviews. Action-wise, there are some good scenes. I like a lot of the music, the locations are pretty spectacular, and make up for the kind of cheap-looking stage sets. There was a time where I would have described this film as being one of my favourite Bond films, believe it or not, and I think it can be a good time if you're young and just getting into Bond, or if you're an adult and you just switch off your brain and enjoy scenes on an individual basis and don't look too much at the intricacies of the plot. However, I do know a good few people who really genuinely love this one, so it's good to see that it has its fans out there. Personally, for all of my quibbles, I do have a good enough time with it. There's a lot of fun, and it's the furthest Bond has ever moved into actually being a broad comedy, so if that's your cup of tea, you'll probably have a good time here. But I can't deny that I'm looking forward to revisiting the next film in the series, which provided a massive course correction and ensured the series' continued life for decades to come: The Spy Who Loved Me. As always, Mr. Bond fans, please do let me know your thoughts and feelings in the comments section below. Are there any points that I've completely misinterpreted, do you think? Or do you strongly agree or disagree with anything that I've said? Please do let me know down below. And you can also head over to my Twitter and my Facebook pages if you would like to join in the conversations over there. And if you would like to go one step further in supporting this channel, then please do also head over to my Patreon page for details in how to do so there. And if you're just on YouTube, like if you like this video, then please do give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, then please do subscribe. That would also be very helpful in helping the channel to grow and hopefully find more people like yourself to hopefully get something out of this content. And until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.